Upstate Medical University in Syracuse, New York invites you to be the informed patient with the podcast that features experts from Central New York's only academic medical center. I'm your host, Amber Smith. A new study on exercising cancer shows that when muscles are exercising, they pump out substances that can suppress the growth of breast cancer cells. Here to talk about this research is Dr. Carol Sames. She's an associate professor of physical therapy education, an assistant professor of physician assistant studies, and an exercise physiologist at Upstate. Welcome back to The Informed Patient, Dr. Sames.
Thanks so much, Amber. It's a pleasure to be here.
This sounds really profound, if I'm understanding it correctly. Women who survived breast cancer by exercising, they were able to prevent recurrence of breast cancer. Is that right?
So these investigators found that some biomolecules that get released during exercise decreased cancer cell growth, and some cancer cells died in laboratory-grown breast cancer cells, yes.
Now, did we already know that exercise can help cancer survivors avoid recurrence? Was that already known?
Yes, exercise is truly considered a therapeutic intervention in the management of cancer, and specifically breast cancer, in medicine, in physical therapy, and in exercise science. In fact, the American College of Sports Medicine and the American Medical Association have initiated a global health initiative called Exercise in Medicine. So we know that the research is there, but before this particular study, understanding the mechanisms of how that is associated in terms of exercise and cancer cells wasn't as well understood.
Were these previous studies done in mice or in people or both?
So clearly the initial studies were done first in mice, and then they started progressing to individuals with breast cancer and colorectal cancer. And these studies have demonstrated that there are beneficial effects of exercise either during or post-cancer treatments, specifically things like fatigue, quality of life, what we would call aerobic endurance, or the ability to continually walk, move, muscle strength, body composition, and that there was a lower recurrence and a lower early mortality rate.
So there have been previous studies that looked specifically at breast cancer survivors, but they didn't look at the mechanism so much as just that this is happening.
Right. To kind of look at the mechanisms. And the other thing is that in this particular study, the women did not exercise during their breast cancer treatment. So one of the problems with exercise is that it ends up being a little confounding if you have some people that are exercising and some people aren't, and then you're looking at recurrence. In this case, these women did not exercise during their treatment.
So what else can you tell us about this study? And it was done in Australia, is that right?
Correct. Yes, there were 32 women, and they finished their treatment for breast cancer. As I mentioned, they weren't engaged in a regular exercise program during treatment. They were randomly assigned to either a single session of what we call strength training, resistance training, or a higher intensity interval type training. They took blood samples at 3 different points in time. So prior to this one bout of exercise, immediately after the exercise, and then 30 minutes post-exercise. And really what they were trying to look at is that we know when muscles contract or move, the muscles release these hormones and biomolecules. And some of these biomolecules that were interesting are things called myokines. And we know that certain myokines can affect immune response, and in the short term, reduce inflammation. And so that's really why they wanted to do this particular study.
And you mentioned some of them were doing some strength training, I guess, with hand weights or kind of light strength training.
So no, they actually wanted to keep the intensity of both interventions similar. The strength training women actually performed 8 different exercises. They were using machines covering the basic muscle groups in the body, some upper body, some lower body. They alternated between upper and lower body. They did each exercise 8 times, and they repeated it 5 times. The intensity was adjusted so that the person felt their exertion was at a high level. So they wanted it to be hard. They rested about a minute or two between each set. So that whole bout for the resistance training people was 45 minutes. And then the high intensity interval training women also exercised for 45 minutes. And what they did is they did little intervals where they were 30 seconds on a piece of equipment. They had their choice of a treadmill, a bike, a rower, and an elliptical. And they repeated those little intervals 4 times, and they had a rest break in between. So both groups exercised at what we would consider a hard intensity, and they exercised for 45 minutes.
So sort of an equivalent workout.
That's what they were aiming for, because comparing a high intensity to something that was low intensity, we know from previous research, high intensity tends to elicit other responses than lower intensity exercise.
Now, did the changes in the cells happen immediately?
So this was the really interesting part. I had mentioned they took blood samples prior to exercise. Nothing changed in either group, but the blood taken immediately after exercise and then 30 minutes later had much greater levels of these biomolecules, these myokines. And what they found is that immediately and 30 minutes after, cancer cell growth was reduced in both of those particular blood samples, and that occurred immediately and even 30 minutes after that exercise.
This is Upstate's The Informed Patient Podcast. I'm your host, Amber Smith. I'm talking with Upstate exercise physiologist Carol Sames about an exciting study on exercise and cancer that shows when muscles are exercising, they pump out substances that can suppress the growth of breast cancer cells. Now, did either type of exercise prove to be more effective than the other?
Interestingly, the higher intensity, that interval cardiovascular training, had a greater cell cancer growth reduction, and it was also associated with a higher concentration of those biomolecules that we were talking about. So if you think about it, it makes sense. If I am doing strength training, I'm usually working a couple of muscle groups, and it's not the same as potentially being on a bike or an elliptical or a rower where I'm going continuously. And that particular group, they were doing 30 seconds at a time, and then they were repeating that. So it makes sense that if we just think about the muscle, there was more muscle mass involved in the cardiovascular activity compared to the strength training activity. There was more muscle contractions, and therefore there were more of these myokines, these biomolecules that were released.
So the cardio has something to do with it, it sounds like.
Yeah, I think just because you had more muscle activation of large muscle groups, that's what they're thinking. Now, of course, this will need to be replicated. And the other important aspect of this is that the cell cultures were not grown in the body. They were in a laboratory in a petri dish. But still, it's really kind of exciting because we've known for a while that these biomolecules that get released do seem to have an anti-inflammatory response. So that's really exciting.
Now, is weight training still important in this?
Absolutely. In fact, I think this is the one big change that we've seen in the exercise research is that we need muscle to move. We need muscle to function, just to be able to complete activities of daily living. We also know that weight training can increase bone density, muscle mass, and we know that muscle requires energy. Unfortunately, fat mass sits and takes up space in the body, but muscle mass needs energy to exist. And so it burns off calories even when we're sitting. If we look at fall risk and balance, we know that strength is clearly implicated in, particularly loss of strength is implicated in falls. A stronger muscle can actually do more work with less energy and fatigue. So that's really important. Reduction in cardiovascular disease risk, all-cause mortality. There are so many things that implicate strength training, weight training, resistance training as important to overall health.
Well, I know this is just one study, 30 some odd women, but it was pretty successful results. They saw this improvement in all of the women participants. Can we take that to wonder whether more exercise would produce even more anti-cancer signals and further reduce the risk of cancer recurrence?
I mean, certainly it's interesting. What we know from at least research currently, there was an article that was just published in the British Journal of Sports Medicine this year. They looked at activity from the United Kingdom Biobank. They have about 85,000 people that they were following. And they looked at cancer risk and they found that the individuals that engaged in the highest amount of exercise compared to the individuals who had the lowest amount, that there was about a 26% lower cancer risk. So clearly there seems to be some type of relationship there. But I think really what we're trying to get individuals to do is to get up and move, to reduce sedentary time. And that also becomes another issue when we talk about exercise and we talk about sedentary activity. They're actually two separate risk factors. So just getting people to move, even if it's a little bit, you see a reduction in risk. If we can get people to move a little bit more, you see a higher reduction of risk. But at about 300 minutes a week of cardiovascular activity, you start to see a plateau.
Now, this paper says that more study is still needed. What are the authors suggesting that there is left to learn or that they would want to do in addition to what they've already done?
Well, you would like a larger sample size for starters. In an ideal world, this seems to be working in a laboratory, but at some point you want to jump to the human body, right? And once we talk about the human body, there are so many impacts that are going on in a human body in terms of like, maybe I have chronic stress. I'm constantly stressed, so that my stress hormone, cortisol, is going to be elevated. Some of those bad inflammation and cytokines will be increased. So that becomes tricky when you switch from a laboratory, very controlled situation to the human body. But eventually that's what you would like to see done. You also want to look at maybe individuals that have been exercising for a long period of time and then go through treatment for cancer and then see them. Is there any difference? They only used a single breast cancer cell line, the most common, but there are other cell lines. You would want to check on those. You would also want to look at other types of cancer besides breast cancer. They didn't look at any medications that the women were taking, so that could actually influence these myokines or immune response. And they could also look at other biomolecules and hormone levels to see how they impact cell cancer growth and or death.
So do you think that there's reason to believe we might see the same effects for other types of cancer?
I truly believe that because we already know that regular exercises reduces the risk for currently 13 types of cancer. And so replication in other types of cancer certainly looks very promising.
Now, this looked at cancer recurrence after treatment. Would there be similar benefit, do you think, to adding exercise during cancer treatment?
Yes, because the current research suggests that exercise during cancer treatment can be beneficial, especially at reducing that sedentary behavior that I was talking about, because we know that sedentary behavior has a very strong link to those 13 types of cancer we had previously mentioned. In fact, when you look at the recommendations, exercise during treatment is recommended. But then we also need to understand that we need to individualize that and that there are some special considerations that we might need to take into account. Specifically, if it's women and it's breast cancer, is there lymphedema there? Is there any concerns about neuropathy? If I have tingling in hands or feet, that might alter what I want people to do. Individuals that have lost significant amounts of muscle mass, we might want to be careful in terms of the exercise we do with them. Osteopenia, osteoporosis is not contraindicated in exercise. It just impacts the choices we make. Individuals that have severe fatigue or anemia, you would just want to make special considerations, but that eliminating exercise because somebody's going through cancer treatment, you would really need to have a compelling reason because we know the impact of sedentary behavior and the lack of activity is damaging in terms of recovery and then recurrence.
Well, thank you so much for explaining this research and for making time for this interview, Dr. Sames.
Thanks so much, Amber. It's always a pleasure to be here.
My guest has been Dr. Carol Sames. She's an exercise physiologist at Upstate, and she teaches in physical therapy education and physician assistant studies at Upstate. The Informed Patient is a podcast covering health, science, and medicine brought to you by Upstate Medical University in Syracuse, New York, and produced by Jim Howe, with sound engineering by Bill Brokel and graphic design by Dan Cameron. Find our archive of previous episodes at upstate.edu/informed. If you enjoyed this episode, please invite a friend to listen. You can also rate and review the Informed Patient podcast on Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or wherever you tune in. This is your host, Amber Smith, thanking you for listening.